Now that we've finished quilting our area on the left side of our quilt with our automated quilting system for our home sewing machine, we're going to need to shift our quilt to the left to expose the area to the right that needs to be quilted so we can fill in all of our quilt area at the top of our quilt. We're shifting our quilt horizontally, and we'll need to then line up our design so we can fill in our space. So we're going to remove all of our clamps from our hoop frame and shift our quilt to the left. You can see that I have now shifted my quilt off to the left. All of my quilting is over here on the left-hand side, and I have a little area here off to the right-hand side that I still need to quilt. Depending on the size of your quilt, you may have much more off to the right-hand side that you need to quilt. You may have to repeat your steps going horizontally across your quilt multiple times to fill in everything. Do what you need to do to get your quilt complete. I want to make sure that I am being very careful as I'm shifting my quilt off to the left and rehooping, that I'm keeping things as straight as possible and keeping the distance between my back clamps and my quilt top fairly even as I go, so that I know I'm not shifting things and making it a little bit crooked on my frame. I want to keep it as straight as possible. This is where if you need to put any marking on your batting to keep yourself square, you can do that as well. I tend to eyeball it a little bit and just hope for the best, but it does take some practice. Now, I want to make a note that this quilt is basted with safety pins. So I've got a safety pin down on the bottom corner and one all the way out here in the corner right now. I did have some in the top of my quilt that I took out, and I did run some stitching across the top and side of my quilt to hold it into place so that it doesn't shift when we're working with it and our automation. If you have safety pins in your quilt, make sure you remove the ones that will be in the area in which you are quilting. You do not want to hit a safety pin with your machine while it's stitching. You'll end up breaking a needle, or you might end up throwing an error code with your automation. So make sure you take those out. Some of you may baste your quilt with safety pins, others may thread baste, and others of you may even use basting spray. It's just a matter of what's going to work best for you. I just happen to use safety pins, and that's why I took them out, because we're going to be working with this area next. Now that we're ready to start working with our design, let's talk for a quick minute about the blue crosshairs you see on your display. You have a vertical and a horizontal line that meets on your display. The intersection of these two lines represent where your needle is located. As you move your machine on the carriage, you will notice that your crosshairs move around your display. The crosshairs are following where your needle is. I'm going to use these crosshairs a lot to help keep myself lined up with where I need to go. The first thing I want to use my crosshairs for is to double check that the top of my layout box and the bottom of my layout box are still within the quilt space that I need to have. I want to make sure that I didn't put my quilt on here crooked and I might accidentally hit my machine against my bars back here. I'm going to move my crosshairs with my machine as far back as I can until I feel my machine hit my back bar. I can see that the horizontal line of my crosshairs has plenty of space between that blue line and the orange line of my pattern layout box. So if I pull that forward to where the blue line and the orange line meet, I know that that's where the top of my quilt design is going to be, and I can get my hand back there so I know I'm not going to risk hitting anything on the back of my frame. Likewise, if I pull my machine on its carriage towards me, the crosshairs are going to move towards the bottom of my layout area. And I can see when I pull as far forward as I can, the blue crosshairs are below my orange layout box area. If I push them up to line things up, and my blue line and my orange dotted line meet each other, I am still in my quilting area without hitting any of the bars on either end. I still can get my hand behind my machine before it hits my back bars. So I don't need to adjust anything there. The other thing that I can do is locate where my pattern left off on my last round and line my crosshairs up with that, because that's where we're going to need to line up the start of our next pattern. I'm going to line my needle up where the end of my last pattern left off, and my crosshairs are floating here in the middle of my screen. We are now ready to start placing our design. Now remember, for the quilt that I'm working on, because it's very small and I only have a very tiny area here that I still have left to fill in, I only needed to shift my quilt off to the left a small amount. So my starting point is here, about 3/4 of the way down my frame. But if you are working with a much larger quilt, when you rehooped, your starting point might be all the way down here because you've had to move your quilt farther. So our starting points are all going to be in different places depending on what quilt we're working on. It's just important to remember that your starting point is going to be where your last pattern left off. I have my needle hovering right above the end point of my last pattern. What we need to do now is get the start point of our pattern in the exact same place as the end point of our last pattern so we can make it continuous. To do that, we're going to use our editing feature called Move. We're going to go from our home screen back down to our edit feature. That's located on the left-hand side of your display. It's underneath the home button, and it looks like a little square with a pencil in it. When it's highlighted, it turns green with a white background, and you can see you get your editing features here off on the right-hand side. Our Move feature is the second one down on the inside green ribbon. It's a square, and it looks like it has a little cross with arrows on the ends in the middle. When we highlight that, it turns orange with a white background, and we get our Move features, where we can move our design up, down, left, and right. For what we're doing right now, we're going to need to move our design off to the right because we want to get the green start point circle of our design all the way over here where our crosshairs meet so that our design connects with our last row that we quilted. I'm going to use my arrow that points off to the right, and it's going to shift my design bit by bit all the way over to where my crosshairs are. This may take a little bit of time depending on how far you have to move yours. Like I said, I have to move mine pretty far down my frame because I'm using a very small quilt and I don't have a lot left to quilt. But if you have a big quilt and you've shifted your quilt very far to the left, you may not have to move very far at all to get this lined up. As we're going along, it's just shifting increment by increment, and I can see my green dot getting very close to where my crosshairs are. I'm going to just inch that bit by bit now so I don't go too far, but if I do, I can always shift it in the opposite direction. And it looks like I am pretty close there. To double check on how close I am, I can always use my zoom button, which is down here at the bottom left corner of your screen. It looks like a spyglass with a plus sign in it. I can hit that and get a little bit closer view of what I'm looking at. And it looks like I might need to pop over just one more little increment, and I may need to shift my design up just a hair. So I'm going to use my up arrow. And now that I've done that, my green circle is pretty on top of where my crosshairs meet. So that's going to be my location of where I'm going to start. My green dot, or the start of this pattern, is going to pick up right where my last pattern stitched out and finished off. So that's lined up where I need it to be. But you'll notice that I have a lot of pattern that's probably going to be too much for me because I only have a little bit of space that I need to quilt out. You may have a lot of space you need to quilt out. This is always going to depend on what you're quilting and how much you've shifted your quilt off to the left or the right, depending on which direction you move your quilt. I'm not going to need all of this design work that's out here, so I'm going to remove some of it within my editing features as well. I'm going to go up to my repeat button, which is above my move button. It looks like a little square with arrows coming out of each side, and it has a plus sign on it. When I highlight that, it turns orange, and I have my repeats available to me. Now, my first row of quilting was 4 repeats, but I don't need 4 repeats of my design to finish this out here. I'm going to remove some repeats with my minus button. I took one away, and I'm down to 3 repeats. And I took a second one away, so I'm down to 2 repeats. I think this is a little more realistic for what I have left of my quilt. But let's double check. We're going to use our crosshairs and slide our machine down to the end of our quilt area that we have here and make sure that the design that we have left will cover what we have left to quilt. As I slide my machine, you can see my crosshairs move, and I'm double checking to make sure that I'm covering all of my quilting area. I'm all the way out here and I am on my batting, so I know that what I have left is going to be covered with those 2 repeats. If I take one of the repeats away, let's see what happens. Oops. So if I take one repeat away and move to the end of where the design is, I'm not quite at the edge of my quilt. So I think I want to keep the 2 full repeats so that it finish off this last inch of my quilt here, and I know the whole thing is covered. This is something that you'll have to work on depending on what your quilt looks like and how much quilting you have left to do. You may need to do all 4 repeats if you're doing a larger quilt, and you may even have to rehoop a second time if you're doing a very large quilt to get your horizontal all the way across. Every quilt's going to be individual, and you'll take your time and learn what you need to do based on what you have available. Now that we know that we're working with 2 repeats for what I have left here on my quilt, I'm going to move my machine back into place, hover my needle, which is my crosshairs on my display, right above the little green circle that is the start of my pattern. I'm going to make sure everything's lined up and ready to go so that we can start our stitch out. My needle is above the end point of the pattern that I stitched out first. And you can see that my crosshairs is right on top of the green start button of this pattern. It's very tiny, but you can still see it underneath those crosshairs. That's where the pattern's going to start. From here, it's time to get stitching. We are going to move out of our editing screen and go to our home button, which is at the top left corner of our display. When we highlight our home button, our home turns purple with a white background, and we have things that look a little bit funny right now because we used our zoom button in our edit. Remember, we zoomed in with our spyglass with a plus sign, so if we want to look at this a little bit better before we stitch out, let's zoom out by using our spyglass with the minus sign. I'm going to touch that just a couple times to get this into view, and now we can see what we're working with. We are ready to get stitching, And when we're ready to put our design onto our fabric, we always need to make sure that our needle is engaged so that we will stitch out instead of simply tracing. Our needle is engaged when our needle with the little piece of thread that runs through it is orange and highlighted white, as you see here in the display screen. If it's not highlighted, like this, make sure you touch on that and highlight it before you start stitch out. Now that we're ready to stitch out, we're going to go to our green circle at the top right-hand corner of our display to get started. I'm going to touch the green circle, and we're starting to get our instructions. Our first instruction says the machine will move to the start of the pattern block, and the pattern will start. Verify that your needle is in the up position. It's always important to make sure that your needle is not down in your fabric for any reason, because once we start the automation, the motor box is going to take control of the carriage and start moving our machine around. And if our needle's down in our fabric, we risk tearing our quilt. So we always want to double check that our needle is in the up position. My needle is up, so I'm going to hit the green check mark on my display. My robotics just moved my machine directly into place where it needs to be to start, and now I get a new direction. It says do a single stitch with your quilting machine. So I'm going to hold on to my top thread and use my needle up down button on my sewing machine and do a single stitch. Once I've done that, I'll hit my check mark. I get a new instruction that says pull up the bobbin thread and press OK. At this point, I have free rein to move my machine because I've released from my motors so that I can grab that little teeny tiny bobbin thread and bring it up to the surface with my top thread, and I can hold on to both of my tails. I can hit my check mark now, and my robotic system is going to recalculate and move back into that start position. Now I'm instructed to cycle my needle to lock my stitches. I do locking stitches, and I usually lock my stitches 3 times when I'm at the start and the end of a pattern. But if you're a quilter who likes to bury their threads in their quilt, make sure that you just leave nice long tails for yourself to do that, and you can skip this stitch. Simply hit the check mark when you're finished. Our next instruction says turn on stitching on your long arm, and your machine will start moving after you press OK. So we've got 2 things to do at one time. Turning on our stitching is going to be turning the stitching on for our machine, and for my particular setup, that means turning the stitching on my stitch regulator. Once I do that, I need to hit the check mark on my display so that my motor box starts moving my carriage as well. So the stitch regulator is going to get my needle going up and down, and then when I hit the check mark here on display, my motor box is going to be engaged and is going to start moving along with my pattern. Let's do that now. I'm going to hit the start on my stitch regulator. My needle is going on my machine, and I'm going to hit the check mark on my display, and off it goes. So we are going to stitch out our design. I'm going to let this run, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Now I finished quilting out what I had left here on my quilt. It started quilting here into my batting, and I actually chose to use the little red stop circle that's in the top right-hand corner. I stitched out everything that I needed to and decided that I didn't need to continue any longer, so I used my red stop button and stopped my stitching completely. There's no reason for me to continue quilting on my batting, and I didn't want to risk my carriage hitting the sides of my frames, stitching anything that was unnecessary all the way out here where I don't need any stitching at all. Remember to only use your stop button if you want to shut down your stitching completely. It will take you out of stitch mode and you will have to go back in a different way. If you simply want to pause your stitching, remember that you have that big red pause button across the bottom of your display while it's stitching, where you can hit that and temporarily pause what you're doing and go back exactly where you left off. But since I finished out my row, I hit my stop button and turned off my stitch regulator so my machine stopped stitching. We now have a full row of stitching all the way across our little quilt top. From end to end, I have my beautiful design all stitched in. I think we're ready to advance our quilt and put our next row underneath our first row. So we will work on doing our vertical repeating now. We've now rehooped our quilt so we can start our next row. Our first row that we have quilted is all tucked up here underneath our clamps on our back bar. We're going to quilt the space underneath this first row. We shifted our quilt into place so that we can start at the left-hand side of our quilt and quilt across our quilt going to the right. We have managed to get our quilt situated on our frame where there's a little bit of the stitching from our first row still exposed in front of our clamps. If we move our machine up, we can still get our needle to hover close to the stitching. So when we nest, we'll be able to nest close to the stitching of our previous row. But I can still pull my machine far enough forward where the layout box that I previously had laid out from my last row is still within the quilting space of the throat of my machine. So I don't have to reset my layout area, but we do have to work with getting our design back into place where it needs to be. Because we moved around our design to complete our last row, we need to move our design back into place to start our next row, and I'm going to have to add my repeats back in here so that our design fills the entire space again. So we're going to do the reverse of what we did when we completed the end of my first row of stitching. We're going to come back into our edit feature, which is located at the top left-hand corner of your display. It looks like a little square with a pencil in it. When you highlight that, it turns green with a white background. We're also going to use our minus button in our little spyglass because we did make this look a little bit bigger so we could get some more detailing in it when we edited it. So now we want to zoom out so we can look at this as a bigger picture. The first thing I want to do is move my pattern all the way back over to the end of my pattern layout area. We're going to use our move feature, which is on the inside ribbon, second icon down. Looks like a little square with a cross that has arrows on the ends, and when we highlight that, it turns orange with a white background. And to move our pattern all the way back over to the left, we've got our left arrow. We can do that simply by touching on the left arrow, and our design is going to move back over. Now, some of you may remember from our training video, we also have the green circle that is in the center of our pattern when it's highlighted with our nodes. I can touch on that green circle and slide my pattern all the way down onto the end of my pattern layout box, and it saves me a little bit of time so that I don't have to hold my finger on that button the whole time. It's your choice on how you move your design back into place. Now that we have our design back into place and my start, or the little tiny green circle, as you can see here, the start of the design is at the beginning of my pattern layout box, I need to go back and fill in the rest of this space. Remember, I deleted some of those designs to fill in the smaller area at the end of my quilt top. Our repeat function is at the top left right-hand corner of our display. It looks like a little square with arrows coming out of the corners and a plus sign. When I highlight that, it turns orange with a white background, and we're coming down to our horizontal repeat. We originally had 4 repeats in this box, so I'm going to add 2 more repeats to fill in that whole space. And now my box is completely filled in again. So we're ready to get this into place with where we've now hooped our quilt. We'll do a little manipulation to get this nested the way we want before we stitch in our next row. Now that I have my quilting row reset so my design looks as I want, it's time to find out exactly where this is going to be located on my quilt top. Let's go back to our crosshairs and find out where everything's going to lie before we start to move it around. I am going to move my crosshair center to where the little green dot is on my design or the start of the pattern. That's going to give me an indication of where my pattern's going to start so that I can make sure it's either near or on my quilt top. I'm going to slide my machine on its carriage over and get my crosshairs to line up with the little green dot on my display. And they line up about here. So my pattern's going to start a little bit off my quilt. I'm okay with that, but I might want to adjust it just a little bit onto the quilt more because I am about 3/4 of an inch from my quilt edge. So we can always move it over to the right a little bit. The next thing I want to check is make sure my top of my stitching is going to line up okay with the original stitching that I had at the very bottom of my first row. I have a little bit of that hanging out here at the bottom row right here underneath my clamps. So if I move my crosshairs and my needle to hover around where my previous stitching was on my first row, I want to make sure that on my screen I can see that the orange layout box is close to where that's going to be. I've got a little bit of space there, so I might want to close that gap by moving my design upward just a little bit so that my rows might be a little bit closer together. Right now, if I were to stitch it out where it is, I probably have somewhere between 3/4 and 1 inch worth of a gap between my previous row and my current row, and that would be a little too much space for me. So let me show you how to move your design up a little bit. We're going to use our edit feature, which is highlighted here, and we're going to go into our move feature. When that's highlighted, it turns orange. I'm going to just move my machine back a little bit to where I'd like the next row to have the very top of the design's end. And that way I've got maybe just 1/4 of an inch gap between my previous row and the new row that I'll be stitching out. On my screen, I can see that there's a little bit of space between my blue crosshairs and the top of my orange layout box with my design in it. I'm going to use my up button to move my design upward. It is going to move outside of my orange layout box. In this circumstance, that is okay because I can still get my fingers behind my machine here where my needle area is not touching anything. So I can quilt outside of that little box in this circumstance to get my design a little bit closer so things are nested just the way I want. I'm just going to use my up arrow and nudge my design just a hair so that it looks a little bit closer, and we're going to quilt just a little bit closer. At the same time, I'm going to give it just 2 nudges over to the right, because remember I said that I was about 3/4 of an inch off over here on the left-hand side. I just want it a little bit closer. So now that I know that my rows are going to be nested a little bit closer up here because I moved my design up, and I'm going to be a little bit closer here on the edge over on the left-hand side because I moved my design over. I'm actually going to move it over one more click. Now I think I'm ready to start quilting because I have just adjusted slightly my pattern so that it's going to fit exactly where I'd like it to be. The other thing you can check is pull your machine towards you, make sure your crosshairs go completely underneath the design and that your machine has space so that it can quilt all the way across. You don't want anything rubbing too hard or touching too hard on your automation system. You can always check your complete row across the top as well by moving your machine and double checking your crosshairs as you go so that you know your design's going to line up the best you can as you go all the way across your quilt top. You really are just using the features that are available on your screen, and those crosshairs are going to become your best friend. So now that I've double checked that my design is nested where I'd like it to be, that I've got it close enough to the side of my quilt so that my stitching will begin mostly on my quilt top, I think I'm ready to stitch out my next row. As your robotic system is quilting, you can actually follow along the crosshairs on the screen to see exactly where you are in the design. It's really helpful so that you can watch this and make sure you know where your machine is moving to and how far you are from the end of your design, knowing that you're going to need to turn off your stitch regulation when you get to the end and finish the steps that are assigned to you. Here we are at the end of our design. We've ended on the little red square. I'm being told to turn the stitching off on my long arm, so I'm going to go to my stitch regulator and hit stop. Then I'll hit the check mark on my display. Now I'm being told to cycle my needle to lock my stitches, so I'll use my needle up, needle down button on the side of my machine. Again, if you're someone who likes to bury your threads, you'll want to skip that step. And I can hit my check mark. I've now completed this whole portion of this row, so I'm going to make sure my needle's up. I can then scoot my machine off to the side, bring it back into place, and pull my bobbin thread up to the surface. And then I can clip my threads. Now I'm ready to go on and rehoop so that I can do the rest of the portion of my quilt horizontally across and go on to my next row. It's that easy to fill in your quilt with your home automation sewing system. I really love how easy it is to get the perfect quilting of automation with your home sewing machine in such a small and compact setup.